So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and we return to the realm of free-for-alls today with 4 teams of 2 battling it out over this series of lakes located in the RHOVANNION. So who shall reign supreme? Will it be the humans of the present day, the Numenorians of the past, the Orcs of Mordor, or their rebellious underlings to other factions of Orcs that will be working against the forces of Mordor today? So we'll get right into things. A little cursory glance over the map first of all, obviously dominated by these large bodies of water in the middle. You obviously have the very outer perimeter of the map really that can be traversed by all the factions, but there is also this road that passes through the middle which Mordor currently occupy. But for the most part, while cavalry will certainly play its part, there are plenty of open spaces. The fact that the water dominates so much of the map does mean that there is going to be a little bit of restriction on how armies can move, and indeed how and who are going to be engaging with one another first and foremost. But we'll see how that goes. I mean, the most obvious battles to erupt first and foremost will be the ones over here, because it's by far the closest of the factions on display, and it also allows us to start off with the player who sent me this battle replay, which is Sin of the Dark Cloud. And it is going to be 2 Numenor armies that make up Team 1, as they shall be dubbed from here on out. Sin very often playing as Numenor. Certain players have their favourite factions, and that is very much not a hidden thing. Numenor Royal Guard, I mean, in terms of a skirmish fight, Mordor can engage in such things with their numerous archers, but generally speaking, with their higher armour focus and just general quality, Numenor should be just fine in a skirmish fight with Mordor. The Numenor Royal Guard, also a reasonably solid unit of spears as well, if such things are necessary against Mordor's cavalry. Something that most certainly will be useful are the Numenorian Shield Guard over here. They'll be very, very difficult for Mordor to wear down with their infantry, and of course the armour piercing on their spears does mean that a lot of the Mordor units, especially the more basic Mordor Orcs, will really struggle to make an impression on the quality of the Shield Guard. Unless Mordor can swamp over them with sheer numbers, the Numenor front line will really be fancying their chances with units such as this. The Numenorian cohort backing them up, of course, do not have armour piercing, but they are better suited for facing off against infantry in, less armoured infantry, shall we say, in sustained combat. They don't have the anti-cavalry bonus either, but a very high base damage, so that's really the trade-off between the two, and ultimately when it comes to holding a line, both of these 2 units will do it very successfully against a faction like Mordor. On the flank, we have a unit of Seafarers of Nindamos. I would be very surprised to not see more of them, because the javelins are very deadly, and also when they run out of ammunition, they're perfectly serviceable as a unit of infantry as well. So yeah, there's really no reason not to bring them, and they're perfectly reasonably priced as well, especially in comparison to the rest of the Numenor roster, which is of course quite expensive. Royal Legion of Armenelos are one of the best, if not the best, human sword and board unit, if you call the Numenorians humans. Mainly because they have a few more men in the unit. It's not quite the same sort of dominance that the Pharazim Swordmasters display in class, but the Royal Legion of Armenelos still are going to be superior in this regard to anything that Mordor have to offer. The Uruk captains do have that armour piercing, but we'll get onto that when we're going through the Mordor armies. Pharazim Swordmasters are here. I mean, of course they are Pharazim Swordmasters with that 3rd hit point. Really, really dangerous unit, and of course when it comes to slicing through legions upon legions of orcs, something like this is always going to be a pretty safe bet. Numenorian steel bows are the sort of unit which can actually be fairly difficult to use effectively because of their very limited ammunition. We shall see if they can find the right targets to focus down, but if they can be really good bodyguard hunting units. But if you use them on basic infantry, it's not really worth your while because they are fairly expensive, and the ammunition supply, as I've said, is very low. 2 units of them. We also have the Pharazim Nobles, a multiple HP unit of melee cavalry. Again, against a lot of the Mordor units. I think the Melkor's Chosen might actually be slightly better in cavalry on cavalry combat, but in this sort of situation it's a very even sort of fight. Mordor have got more mounted options than Numenor, it must be said. We'll see. And obviously it's not just Mordor Numenor have to concern themselves with. They are the closest factions, but in a free-for-all you're going to have to prepare yourself for a variety of foes. And another unit of Seafarers there. Sin's ally is going to be Eclipse 2500 of the Dark Cloud. He has got some Numenorian cohorts. More Numenorian cohorts skulking around in the trees. Balagaya Footmen, so going for the slightly more affordable options here, without the armour upgrade as well. As far as spears go, they are very basic, but it is pretty much your only choice as Numenor if you want to put up a front line that is reasonably priced, shall we say. Not exactly low priced, because they aren't really a militia tier unit, but they are a basic human spear unit. and that means that they're not going to do a ton of damage against enemy infantry, but they're perfectly serviceable for holding the line. Of course, next to them is the Numenorian Shield Guard, which are fantastic because of that armor piercing, as we've already said. Some Belagire archers, which are going to be really good in skirmish fights, not just against Mordor, but against the other factions that are on display today. That little buckler really does make a pretty decent difference. Several units of Seafarers. You also have the Naru Sentinels, which were interestingly missing from Sin's army, but considering this isn't a siege battle, they aren't exactly a no-brainer. Even still, I mean, if it does come down to a slogfest in the late game, you would certainly rather have a unit of pikes like this on your side than not, so at least one of the Numenor players has brought them. Belagire pikemen may be more basic, but they are still here. And also the Rangers, Arthedain Shadowbows. There is the opportunity to get into choke point battles on this map and utilise body-piercing projectiles like this, and even then, Arthedain Shadowbows are the most heavily armoured of all the Rangers, so they can at least mitigate that weakness that most Rangers have. We've also got some Numenorian Vanguard, which again, single HP cavalry in the current version of the game, not really as good as it could be. Having said that, they can still be used to pretty good effect. If they ride with the Pharazim Nobles as well, it's a fairly scary little cavalry force that Numenor can field, ironically enough, considering in the actual lore it's not really a big focus of the Numenorians, but it is what it is. And Pharazim Swordmasters are here as well. So let's move on to their most immediate potential problem in Mordor, starting off with Mevin. He's got some Moran on guard. Interesting choice to bring the Moran on guard. Yes, the spears are going to be somewhat useful for their anti-cavalry capabilities, but I don't know. I mean, they're not going to be very good against the Mordor infantry, that's putting it mildly. The Minas Morgul Chosen are the better choice in that regard because they are at least heavily armoured, very solid as far as Mordor's infantry options go, but again, Numenor have got all of the tools necessary to counteract that. Mordor's advantage is going to have to come from elsewhere, like their numbers, plenty of orc fodder here, which they could use to be hyper-aggressive against the Numenorians as they are set up. Moran on halberds offer them a good phalanx as well, which, considering the fact Numenor haven't gone too heavy into their pikes, Moran on halberds could be a great equaliser here if they do choose to advance into Numenor's territory, or if Numenor advance towards them. The Beasts of Gorgoroth we've seen be useless on pretty much every occasion we've seen them of late, but they are in theory very similar to the Mumakil, only they are even more fragile than the Mumakil are in the mod at the moment. They do have javelins on their back, which I do prefer to the archers, because it does mean they're going to be able to do more damage per projectile, but generally speaking, the Beasts of Gorgoroth are more trouble than they're worth, but I'm all for Mevin trying to prove me wrong here. Orc javelins, I mean, the armour-piercing range damage is going to be very important against a variety of foes today. Temple Guard obviously apply that in a higher quality, longer range kind of way. Olag High, I don't know against Numenor. Numenor have got all of the tools they really need to burn down trolls pretty quickly. But if they can be committed at the right time against the right foes, Olag High and any troll indeed can build up a very high kill count very, very quickly. WK fighting alongside Mevin today, got some upgraded Temple Executioners. Not quite as strong as the Pharazim Swordmasters, but not a million miles away when they have that armour upgrade with them. Some upgraded Temple Inquisitors as well, a nice unit of melee cavalry. The cavalry game in a free-for-all can be somewhat chaotic, but this is the kind of unit that can help you win it. Blackguard of Barad-dûr are a no-brainer in a siege battle, but in a situation like this it's a little bit more complicated because their abilities in just straight-up combat are not quite as good as maybe you might expect, but again, we shall see. Got some Orc Maulers, standard Orc Maulers, armor piercing is all well and good, but they are very fragile. Sauron's Wheel once again representing Mordor's higher tier option in this regard. And then there's also some Moran on infantry, halberds and fodder as well. Potentially some more hidden units in and amongst the trees. I know WK's army, I think it was the one with the very small deployment zone. You basically have this area in which to deploy his army, which is probably why Mevin went over here and not to the other side of the lake over there, so they could be prized apart. But we'll see how Mordor get on. Now for the rebellious orcs, we have Dreezy 4K. Blimey, what year is it? Anyway, he's back, and he's going to be playing as Isengard. We've got some Uruk-hai archers. As far as the skirmish fight goes, I mean, Isengard are not the best at a long-range skirmish fight, but they at least have the option to engage in such things with the archers here. The Uruk-hai Reavers adding a little bit of armour piercing, which against all of the factions we've seen so far, and in fact I think against every faction on the field today, armour piercing is going to be at least partially useful. Uruk-hai crossbows are the area where Isengard can really lay down a bit of a marker at range, and especially in a map like this where, you know, the waterways can restrict people's movement, you can post up in pretty advantageous positions. Uruk-hai crossbows could be a real match winner, we shall see. Uruk-hai pikes, we've already seen actually several factions so far. I mean, Mordor have brought a fair few halberds, Numenor have maybe reneged on bringing a few of their pikes, but Isengard are always going to bring a healthy number of Uruk-hai pikemen because of the advantage that it can potentially give you in those line battles which are going to erupt. And Isengard don't have quite the same level of quality at the high end that Mordor do, or indeed across their whole army that Numenor do. So pikes are somewhat of a necessity against foes like this to equalise things somewhat. Isengard are by no means weak, but they are outclassed by certain factions in terms of quality in the game. Trolls of the White Hand here as well, very much the same sort of thing as the Uruk-hai we've already seen. Champions of the White Hand as well, possibly the most dangerous in terms of outright damage anti-cavalry cavalry unit in the game. So very, very savage, very, very dangerous. We shall see how the battle treats them. And FFA Muffins is going to be fighting alongside Isengard today with his Angmar army. Angmar, of course, very good when they are taking a very aggressive stance, albeit with units that are, technically speaking, more defensive in terms of their approach. Gundabad Guard being one such example, a heavy unit of spears with a big shield. The Witch-Round Pikemen, very similar actually to the Uruk-hai Pikemen we've already seen, but they have a unit cap of 2 rather than 3, so Angmar are not quite the same pike-focused faction that Isengard are. Angmar Halberds also offer them a low-tier unit of Halberds, potentially a very cost-effective unit, but also potentially something that can be very easily dealt with by the enemy if you're not careful. Another unit of Gundabad Guard there. Another unit of melee cavalry, so everyone bringing their high-tier melee cavalry today with the Witch-Round Inquisitors. They've got a nice shield to go along with their gear, but not quite the same level of attack power as the Champions of the White Hand. Trolls of Gundabad, already mentioned heavy trolls several times in this preamble. Blackwatch Legion, very much the same sort of thing as the Blackguard of Barad-dûr, only they are better at what they do on an individual level, but they are more expensive, so don't know whether it's going to be all that worthwhile on a map such as this. Warg Riders, and in a situation such as this. So some Warg Riders on both flanks, and plenty of anti-cavalry, cavalry on display today. There's almost certainly going to be more units hidden in and amongst these pine trees as well. And then the final team on display today, the so-called present-day humans. We have Enxfits, what used to be Enxfits. Again, these are some names I haven't seen in quite a while, which is interesting. He's playing as Arthedain. Evendim Spearmen with the armour upgrades. We've got some Arthedain Marksmen here as well. Probably going to be fairly standard fare as far as Arthedain goes, I would imagine. A very cost-effective front line of upgraded Evendim Spearmen and upgraded Arthedain Pikemen. Not going to be winning any races in terms of how quickly they can kill units, but a very cost-effective front line. Very difficult to get through in pure melee terms in a quick fashion. And Arthedain, of course, do have some higher quality options, including the dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights. They may not have armour piercing, but their base damage is very good, and considering the number of Orcish factions on display today, generally speaking, heavy swordsmen can be pretty good against them. Very good at dealing with high numbers units. Arthedain Men-at-Arms, and obviously some Numenor Gate Guards in here as well, a higher tier pike unit. Not a melee cavalry unit, but pretty much Arthedain's best unit at fighting other cavalry in melee anyway. They're Lance Knights, they're Knights of Numenor. They need to be careful in this battle though, because there are several units we've already seen which will beat them 1-to-1 in melee. But no unit of cavalry that we've seen so far will have their level of impact off a charge. So Enxfits potentially does have the opportunity here to do some grievous damage to his enemies, and he is going to be fighting alongside DF Morris, who's playing as Dale. Earls of Dale, basic melee cavalry, but more melee cavalry nonetheless. It's the only thing Dale really have. They certainly are at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to their cavalry options, given the meta of the game at the moment, and its disdain for single HP cavalry. Even so, he's gone for some Dalian cavalry as well. I mean, they can be decent off a charge, but again, they're going to need to be on point with that cavalry use to make their inclusion worthwhile. Barding Herd, probably the best halberdier unit we've seen so far on the field today. The Orcish factions bringing their share of halberds, but none of them quite as good or as solid as the Barding Herd. Also, some more phalanx units in the shape of the Lake Town Pikemen, basic pikes, but as we've said before, basic pikes are still very much worth your while. Dismounted Earls of Dale as a unit of line infantry are also very effective. Combined with the Dalian phalanx units, that's a very classic combination. Dalian spearmen in and amongst some Earls of Dale. We have some more Earls over here, and probably the full lineup of Dalian skirmishers here, seeing as we haven't seen them up till this point, and that is pretty much the primary focus of the faction of Dale. Dalian Royal Guard, which are the standard multiple HP bodyguard archers. We have the Blackshot Dragon Slayers, which are the armour piercing variant. We've already seen the Temple Guard in this battle already. Some upgraded Bardian Marksmen and upgraded Dalian Bowmen making up the Dalian firing line, which, to be fair, should be able to overcome, I think, considering their the word escapes me at the moment, their lineups, the Numenorian players, in terms of the archers that they have brought, their compositions I should say. They haven't brought a huge amount of archers, so Dale and Arthedain may feel quite comfortable in skirmishing with them. Of course they will against Isengard and Arthedain, Isengard and Angmar, who will almost certainly be having to be aggressive at some point in the battle, but when they choose to do so will make a big difference in a free-for-all. But of course Numenor and Mordor are the ones that are closest together, so I guess we'll start off over there. But yeah, I guess without further ado, nice trench in the distance over there, but yes, without further ado, let's get this show on the road, shall we? So I do believe it will be the lake that we can see here that will be clearly the bigger impact on this fight than the one that is over yonder, but even still, the choke point that this one helps to create with the Mordor forces is still going to be pretty significant, and Numenor have already made their choice really before the battle itself, with Sin already being over here and the rapid reinforcements from Eclipse coming over this way. Rather than banking up against their fellow humans over in the mountains over there, they are going to try and take on the orcs over here. A little bit more open perhaps, and they don't really want to be advancing towards Dale and Arthedain when they are dug in after all, even though Numenor can skirmish. Maybe not to the extent that the more modern humans are able to do. It's also going to be interesting to see how the rebellious orcs are going to try to tackle things. It does look as though the initial movements may be that they could move to try and surround the Mordor force, which finds itself on this narrow corridor, perhaps more out of necessity than anything else, due to WK's very weird deployment zone, which was very small. But even so, they could have spread out across the lake perhaps and then tried to envelop Numenor, or come down over here against the rebellious orcs. That was a choice of theirs to make. They have chosen to consolidate, but that does also mean they've got far less room to maneuver if the enemies do decide to try and surround them, although I do think Angmar moving off this way, those wargs are going to be more of a screen than anything else to prevent any sort of Mordor counterattacks, which do seem to be maybe forthcoming, but so far we are seeing relatively small amounts of movement from most factions, but Mordor are actually going to try and escape the trap in which they find themselves. If Isengard and Angmar do wave off and try to face Arthedain and Dale over here on this side of the map within these trees, that does give them the opportunity to occupy the territory that Isengard and Angmar once held and ultimately get out of this narrow corridor, which Numenor may try to take advantage of. Obviously, the narrower the battlefield, the higher quality troops are going to be more effective, and certainly Mordor's more basic infantry is going to really struggle if it comes down to a straight up fight against the Numenorians. Not that Mordor are absent quality, indeed at the high end they've got some very high tier stuff, but overall, in terms of the equilibrium, you certainly imagine that if it comes down to a narrow battlefield, the Numenorians are going to have the edge, which is why I really don't think Mordor wants to be in this particular situation. They do have some things which can help equalise the fight, like javelins, but I'm not so sure. We shall have to wait and see. Angmar going back this way now, with Isengard also doubling back, which is obviously bad news for Mordor, because it means that the option that they may have had to try and go down this way is ultimately completely locked off to them. On one side Numenor, on the other Isengard and Angmar, neither of which is going to be too appealing. Obviously though, the faction this suits most of all is going to be the Arthedain-Dalian alliance. As I've mentioned with several free-for-alls in the past, the one that stays out of the fight most, whether by accident or by design, tends to be the one to go on into the late game and do very, very well. And Arthedain and Dale, as long as they put on the appearance that they're still marching towards their foe, even if the battle gets underway before they arrive, that is something they can certainly turn to their advantage. Numenor starting to push forward just a little bit more with the spears out in front. It is worth mentioning that the Numenorians do have a little bit of cavalry over here, the Numenorian vanguard, both units of them, preventing any sort of sneaky play perhaps from the Dalian cavalry, but yeah, the Dalian cavalry doesn't really want to be tangling with the Numenorians. One unit of Pharazim nobles would be enough, and they are on station if Numenor do need to panic here in behind their own lines. But the first casualties are going to be inflicted here. Actually, I think Mordor are also going to be getting involved. Actually, no, Isengard are actually merely pulling back from the Mordor front line, so Isengard menacing Mordor, merely not allowing them to retreat, which is an interesting strategy, because Mordor are going to be the ones to suffer from this. As long as Mordor don't decide to double down and actually engage you, as Isengard and Angmar, that may very well suit you come the late game. What isn't going to suit Mordor is taking free casualties like this, though. Numbers are the one thing that they can certainly leverage against Numenor, so they don't want to be losing too much in those terms. Mordor moving back this way now. Out of range of Numenor. Interesting to see the flaming shot being used so early on. Obviously it's not going to cause any routing immediately, but later on it is the sort of thing which Mordor may panic in the face of. Just have to wait and see. Fodder moving forwards just a little bit. I mean, they still don't really have the option, I don't think, of moving down here. I mean, they could try and rush past, but I think Isengard would close the jaws shut on them. Whether that would actually be a wise move or not, I'm not entirely sure. Meanwhile, what have we got going on over here? Are we going to have the first fighting? Yes, we will. The Barrow-wights actually taking charges from the Dalian cavalry. This is actually a good way for this basic lance cavalry to gain some really good value, actually, because their charges will be fairly effective against the Barrow-wights. One way to actually kill them quickly. And I'm a little bit surprised, actually, that Muffins has allowed this to occur. The Barrow-wights are very effective when you fold them into the rest of your Angmar in front line. When they're isolated like this, it can be a bit of a problem. Devastating losses, it is not, but Barrow-wights, of course, very well known for being able to tar pit enemies very effectively, so I don't want to be really losing to basic cav like this. Volleys of archers coming in from behind the Ebondim spearmen. I mean, the Witcher Inquisitors are going to follow through and actually charge into the spears here. I mean, as long as they cycle back out quickly, it won't be the worst thing for them, but if they stay in melee while under arrow fire as well, it's not really the most efficient use of their time. Wargs also coming in. I mean, this is a strange move from Muffins, because between the spears and the Knights of Numenor, the Wargs are not going to hold up too well. Maybe it's just to try and buy time for their Barrow-wights to get out of here, but certainly this is the kind of engagement that I don't really think Arthedain will be too worried about. I mean, the Inquisitors getting a nice charge into the archers, but one-on-one the Inquisitors would fancy their chances against Knights of Numenor, but with spears and other cavalry and of course the archers themselves also raining blows down upon them, this isn't going to be great. Not entirely sure about the use of this cavalry here. I mean, on the face of things, they're gaining good ground and getting some good charges into some somewhat exposed units of infantry, but in the long run, the value proposition isn't really here for Angmar, and this is the problem when you're dealing with basic Arthedain units with some high-tier cavalry in and around them. We shall have to wait and see. Meanwhile, a huge engagement also getting underway here between Numenor and Mordor. So Mordor throwing caution to the wind, perhaps, and advancing a little bit further this way. Numenor, of course, moving to meet them. You can see the more organised force of Numenor here, where Mordor coming forward in a bit more of a mob, but that makes sense and plays to both factions' strengths. The Olakai are in here. The Beasts of Gorgoroth are actually still alive, amazingly enough, despite engaging once. So already they're doing better than they otherwise would. This is already as well a pretty messy engagement. I mean, all the Mordor javelins coming in to try and do some damage to the Numenorians, but the Seafarers are more effective in this way, and I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the initial battle may be won by Mordor, but I think as time goes on, the quality will tell. You know, like high balance of forces, evenly matched indeed. I mean, again, the Numenorian infantry, even the spears, are going to be fairly decent against the Olakai because of the armour piercing. It's really the kind of infantry force that Numenor is not going to enjoy going up against. I think it's one of the most disadvantageous infantry on infantry fights Mordor as a faction can take against Numenor, especially in this kind of situation. It's all going to come down to whether Mordor's supporting units can really do their thing. Temple Guard going to be especially effective as well after a Royal Legion coming in though. Nazgul, I mean, the high tier Mordor stuff is going to be pretty good, you would suggest, against Numenor, but the rest of it is going to struggle. Meanwhile, over here, nothing really, just a token force from Isengard guarding the rear. The rest of the Isengard army probably moving forward to try and assist the Angmarim such as they were. Barrow-wights are here. I mean, this is going to be a better engagement for them. The Ebondim spearmen having to deal with wargs and cavalry so far, kind of exactly the sort of thing they're going to be good at dealing with, but the Angmarim trolls are going to be very effective against Ebondim spearmen, and they're also not really backed up as such. I mean, there are pikes coming in, but the trolls are going to be even more effective against the Arthedain pikemen, doing a lot of damage, buckling their formations. This is the sort of situation in which they're going to need their heavy swordsmen, and all of a sudden what was to their great benefit earlier on, having a slightly ablative in nature front line when it came to dealing with the cavalry, is now going to very much work against them unless they intend to back them up, or maybe they're going to reform themselves a little bit further back and simply accept the fact that these units here are probably going to perish. And I guess they'll be okay with that. I mean, it's only a couple of units of Ebondim Spears and a unit of Pikes they're losing, but any ground they may have gained on the cavalry earlier on is going to be paid back in full and then some by this Orcish assault. Angmar with the initial blow and then Isengard to shore things up is a pretty effective combination. You'd have to say if Arthedain and Dale are to be successful against this duo, they're going to need to use their ranged units to good effect, much like Mordor are going to have to do over here in this narrow gap of fighting. It's actually been a while since we've seen such a chaotic and condensed fight like this that the frame rate starts to drop a little bit, so for old time's sake really, with those wild scenarios that used to be created. This Morgan's chosen. Also that was on like less stable versions of the game, so it was even more of a nightmare to run. Your javelins are here, morale on halberds are on the way forwards. I do believe as elephant class units the corpses of the beasts of Gorgoroth will actually form obstacles, which is kind of going to suit neither side really. They're just going to get in the way. I mean, it's going to suit whoever ultimately ends up losing the fight, so I guess that will be Mordor unless they can rapidly start turning things around here. Blackguard of Barad-dûr could move forward, but I mean, again, they're a unit which is better when Mordor are on the front foot. When they're trying to plug gaps and hold the line, their mass is alright, but the quality of the unit overall is still going to be a bit of a problem. Belagire archers are out of ammunition, just really trying to hammer home their advantage now by just sending forward numbers, which is always a bad sign when you're Mordor if numbers are being applied to the situation and they are not your own. Javelins in behind. I mean, still, Mordor have got plenty of these armour-piercing projectiles, and that may be what does Numenor in the long run in this battle as a whole, because of course Numenor need to beat Mordor, but they then also need to defeat whomever is the victor in this fight over here, which is wider, but is growing no less chaotic, with Isengard now approaching the front line as well, or on the front line. Uruk-hai pikemen, I mean, Arthedain are another heavily pike-focused faction, but 1-to-1, the Uruk-hai pikemen, even with the armour upgrade the Arthedain pikemen have, are going to be the superior option. Dale bringing their own pikes to bear as well, so who is going to be the master of the pointy sticks here? Witchhound pikemen may very well be present somewhere as well. Arthedain pikemen and Laketown pikemen once again. I mean, I assume the trolls have either been peeled off the front line or have perished, because otherwise pikes would not really be the answer here. Barrow-wights, having taken those initial charges, are now much more at home fighting in bogged down infantry fights. Earls of Dale, a strong unit of line infantry, but again, Barrow-wight's a bit of a nightmare to deal with in this kind of situation. Unless the Barding Herd can get into a better formation with the Earls here, the Angmar halberds are also going to be the sort of thing to start bothering the Earls as well, with that armour piercing that they have at their disposal. Dale perhaps trying to overlap on the flanks a little bit, going after some of the more vulnerable Angmar units, a few arrows flying overhead as well. Very difficult to keep track of archers, as I've said several times, when casting these battles, and that is ultimately how Angmar and Dale will be hoping to be victorious here. There goes one of the Numenorian generals. Blackguard and Barad-dûr perhaps doing their thing over there, but as I was saying, I mean, maybe the Orcs not throwing everything forward just yet. Trolls the White Hand are still back there, and actually on the front line now, the numbers perhaps creeping towards Arthedain and Dale, which is not really where the Orcs want to be, because, as I was mentioning, if we do start to see Arthedain and Dale really seize the upper hand here, we can assume that their archers were used at least competently, if not excellently. This is something though. The frame rate over here is extremely crunchy. Is there cavalry action going on over here? There may very well be. Some red arrows clashing with the blue. Numenorian vanguard retreating in the face of the Temple Inquisitors, as well they should. They are not melee cavalry after all, but the Pharazim nobles make life much more difficult for the Mordor cavalry over here. Melkor's chosen as well. The Mordor cavalry individually probably has the beating of the Numenorians here, but Numenor, all they need to do is act defensively with some Numenorian steel bows to help do some damage on the approach as well. That is a bit of a problem, but you can already see here, Mordor attempting a counter-attack. Don't want to get too close to that engagement because it's already starting to tank the frame. Sauron's will following through with the Blackguard of Barad-dûr as well, offering the armour-piercing edge they'll need against the Numenorians, and already, even if Mordor still end up losing this fight, they will have inflicted some fairly grievous wounds on Numenor, and actually as a result of that they may be better off saving their cavalry for later. If they feel as though they can outright win this engagement, then maybe not, but sequestering those 2 units of high-tier cavalry in the backfield for later could be the answer. Pharazim nobles moving forward now, clashing with the Temple Inquisitors. 1-to-1 the Pharazim will win that, and the Melkor's Chosen of course need to carry on through the charge. If Mordor had it their way, I think they would have reversed the roles of those cavalry units, but you work with what you're given. You need to stop those armor-piercing arrows from hitting your cavalry again. Melkor's Chosen having already taken a little bit of damage there.
Only half the enemy force
The
remains.
Temple Inquisitors are perfectly fine as melee cavalry, but we're seeing here the difference between, you know, a bodyguard tier cavalry and not a bodyguard tier cavalry in the current version of the game. Even though they're high tier, the Temple Inquisitors standing no chance against the multiple HP Pharazim nobles. Melkor's Chosen a different proposition. You can see the Melkor's Chosen trying to get through to the Numenor infantry. The Numenorian vanguard will lose this fight heavily, but they just need to get in the way and stop the Melkor's Chosen from having a clean charge, which they've largely already done. Temple Inquisitors trying to push through the lines over here as well. Actually, overwhelming force may be a thing here, but I mean, it looks kind of grim for Numenor, but ultimately they still have an awful lot of units on the front line. As long as their morale holds together, which for a little while there on some of those units it was looking a little bit ropey. These hammer and anvil charges could be fairly decisive as well. Well, we'll see. Pharazim Swordmasters are still there. Mordor making a real fist of this though, considering that, again, this is the kind of fight in this narrow area where quality is going to be fairly key, as I mentioned. So Mordor will be feeling pretty good about themselves, given how things have gone, especially how things look like they were going earlier. Meanwhile, cavalry here, charging into some stragglers that are pushed through the line. I mean, they're guards of Orthanc though, they need to be a little bit careful. The walks are broken. That, I believe, was the Dalian general? Could have been the Isengard one actually, given that it is guards of Orthanc over here. Couldn't see the body as it fell. Arthedain and also the Blackshot Dragon Slayers, presumably having used their ammunition. That being the case, you'd imagine they've done a fair amount of damage. There goes the Witch King General, or the Witch King's General I should say, it's not the Witch King himself, falling over here in this fight. The Earls in melee, also missiles of all descriptions. Troll Slayers are here. Interesting to see the Goblin Trackers being the ones to try and take on the ranged fight now. Troll Slayers in melee are a bit of a problem for both Isengard and Angmar to have to deal with. Very dangerous units indeed. Meanwhile, Dalian Bowmen moving in to try and shore up the line. I mean, there's plenty of gaps in both sides' front lines at this point. I mean, here in the middle, both sides are still fairly strong, with the slight edge going to the humans, you have to say. The Arthedain pikes, the Dalian heavy halberds and spears. A good combination so far. Barrow-wights have longevity though, so if the Orcs can win the flanks, their centre will hold long enough for them to take advantage of that. But again, over here, whoever ends up winning is going to be pretty heavily damaged, you'd have to say, which is what you like to see, because it means whoever wins the other fight as well, it's going to be a battle of the walking wounded, though it may be. A competitive battle nonetheless. A lot of these lighter units, I mean, Angmar Halberds and Uruk-hai Reavers may not be the most dangerous units that the Orcs are fielding, but they are some of the most vulnerable, so I can understand why Dale are trying to focus them down with some Bardian Marks, and also some Witch-round Pikemen in here as well, more heavily armoured, but still fairly vulnerable. Cavalry as well in a free-for-all can be extremely decisive, even in low numbers. We've seen a single unit of cavalry be enough to turn the tide of battle before. Only 2 Trolls of Gundabad remain. It's hard to tell how effective the Trolls have been, but they were certainly responsible for initially gaining some good ground over here for the Orcs, and anything on top of that is just going to be how many kills can they achieve in the interim. Snyder Archers are not going to be up to too much in melee. And again, this is the sort of thing where it's hard to keep track of them. You can see that already the humans are trying to focus them down, but Uruk-hai crossbows getting into a good position to rain bolts down upon the front line is not the sort of thing that Arthedain and Dale can afford, really. Meanwhile, over here, Numenorian Vanguard charging into the rear lines now, so it is looking like mass panic from the Orcs. It was a valiant effort, I have to say, from Mordor. Doubling down and being hyper-aggressive was a good thing, because they were slowly losing the grindier fight earlier on, so trying to throw the kitchen sink at Numenor was the right way to do things, I think, given the disposable units that Mordor ultimately have. There goes one of the generals. In the end, though, the cavalry support maybe was needed a little bit sooner, but given the circumstances Mordor were in, I don't think they could have handled things too much differently, to be honest with you. They were in a disadvantageous infantry fight against Numenor. The correct thing to do would maybe be not to take this and try and retreat, but of course earlier on in the fight Isengard was blocking their passage from doing that, so they did what they could, I suppose. The only thing that maybe I could have suggested differently would maybe be to not use your cavalry, but then that's basically like waving the white flag, really, on this infantry fight, which they felt as though they could win, I guess, which is fine. Sequestering your cavalry away for later on could have been a way to maybe come back into it, but that's a risk, because if someone ends up fairly dominant in the late game, it doesn't matter if they're elite cavalry or not, they were always going to be depleted, and it wouldn't have been enough ultimately for you to win the game, so maybe going out this way is the more honourable thing to do. Numenor, though, more damage than I think they would be comfortable with. I mean, they've still got some very strong units, they've still got cavalry as well, including 17,000 nobles, so they're still in a pretty good position moving forwards in this fight. Plenty of routing units over here. Whoever wins this battle over here is going to need to do so by a decent margin in order to be able to face up to Numenor. Meanwhile, there's green smoke over here, which indicates the witches were able to get somewhat close to the front line. Given how chaotic fights like this can be, it's not too surprising, but it doesn't look like they've actually devastated. I mean, there's a fair amount of dead bodies, I suppose, but it doesn't look like devastating blows. There go the witches again. This could be devastating, though. That was a little bit more like it. A couple of kills on the Knights of Illuminus, hitting centre mass into basic units, but still getting good hits, and ultimately enough to rout the Lake Town pikemen as well. There are the witches being chased down amusingly by pikes. Pikes are not usually the sort of unit which does chasing like this, but needs must. You need to catch those witches somehow. Further volleys from them is not the sort of thing that you can really afford to let happen. Guarding herd moving forwards as well. Danian cavalry running around. Charge in there as well from the Knights of Illuminus, just trying to finish off the witches, and they will do so. They're not the Nazgul, the witches. They're kind of set up to look kind of similar, but while they are several HP in melee, there are so few of them, and they're not quite on the level of the Nazgul in terms of defensive stats and abilities. But it does look as though actually that the humans are going to get the better end of this fight over here, which is fairly interesting. Maybe a sign that they didn't go all in enough. Maybe Isengard blocking Mordor's transit over here was just, put them just that little bit too far away from Angmar to put on a united front, and that set things off on a slightly broken opening. It's a possibility, I suppose, but yeah, I mean, this is actually going to be a fairly decent win, this, for Dale and Arthedain. Maybe in terms, well, certainly I'd say in terms of numbers, more so than the victory that Numenor got, although when you actually look at a lot of these units, some of them are fairly basic pikes and guarding herd are slightly better than basic, as well as the Numenor Gate Guards. Heavendim Spears are going to struggle against Numenorian infantry though, but yeah, I'd say actually maybe Arthedain and Dale have the edge going into the late game here. Kind of depends, I suppose, on how Numenor want to set up. Again, I think they're going to have to make the battlefield a little bit smaller. They're already laying the ground. Farmers and nobles going after one Nazgul. That's the end of Mordor. We witnessed their end, at least. Yeah, they've still got cavalry as well. I think their cavalry is in better shape as well than the Arthedain Dalian cavalry is, and even if it was more even than that, the Pharaohs and nobles can face off against the Knights of Illuminus in melee just fine. Might be interesting to see if there are a few hidden units from Maybe not from Mordor, because they didn't really have too many options in terms of hiding their units, but Arthedain and Angmar and Isengard, I should say, maybe do. Single HP cavalry has actually proven to be useful in this situation. Again, it's much more difficult to use, but it has been used quite well here. A free-for-all, perhaps, when things are more chaotic and gaps can be found, is where even cavalry such as this can find its home. Atlantic Company, Numenorian Vanguard coming in here to try and skewer things. I'm not entirely certain what the benefits of this are. I mean, killing off the Dunedain Mounted Company is all well and good. Any collateral they get on the Knights of Numenor will also help ensure the dominance of the Pharazim nobles as we move into the late game. Numenor already trying some hit and run. Need to consolidate, regroup their forces here, Dale and Arthedain, and then prepare for a final battle. I mean, having a look at some of the high tier units, do they have what it takes to go toe to toe? Dalian Royal a bit bloodied up, but still a strong unit. Same can be said of the Blackshot Dragon Slayers, plenty of pikes, plenty of halberds, which will be extremely necessary, given I think we saw Eclipse still has over 30 Pharazim Swordmasters left, and that's going to be a problem, potentially later on. No, Champions of the White Hand still alive, so Isengard actually still here. The Isengard general does fall, so it must have been the Dalian general that we saw die off earlier on, which morale-wise could yet prove to be something which plays its part. Dunedain Troll Slayers are the sort of thing which can be nasty and sustain melee. I mean, Champions of the White Hand are brutal against other cavalry, but that isn't really the sort of thing which is going to be terribly relevant here, as Engspitz moves to finish Dreezy off. Two players which I'm surprised to see their names again. And there goes Isengard. So, Numenor, you do have to go up to '2 speed here, really, to get through the transit phase of this. But, I mean, Numenor are well within their rights, I think, to post up on a more narrow point. I mean, to be honest, it comes down to whoever has the ranged units to be able to force their opponent to move. Or maybe both of them are out of ammunition. If you can force your opponent to move towards you, then it's fair game in a free-for-all like this. It's not a siege battle situation, where one side has the onus to move forward and the other side does not. Still a little bit of cavalry, maybe a little bit more hit and run can be done. Thoughts turn to, where this actually is. I mean, I suppose it would have to be in the north somewhere, based on how grim and grey things are. It doesn't look as though Dale and Arthedain are in too big of a hurry to move forwards. I mean, is there units returning from routing over here, perhaps? Hidden units unveiling themselves? No, those Snaga aren't. More routing, yeah, it's all Snaga and Goblins. I mean, it looks like a fair amount of units over here, but all of them are trash. None of them are going to come back from routing, unfortunately, for the rebellious Orcs, and indeed both Orcish hopes in terms of the teams that were arrayed at the start of the battle have fallen first, and it is going to be who is the strongest, the men who used to be, or the men who are. Not too much in the way of cavalry left for Arthedain. And you have to say, I mean, what's going on over here? I assume this is all routing stuff. Yeah, it's all the remnants. Dale and Arthedain maybe being told they have to move forward. I mean, I think in a situation like this, I'd be okay with saying it's on the players to force someone to move forward, perhaps. There is no pulling rank in this situation. Steel bows, but they've almost certainly used up all their ammunition. They don't have much ammo at all. Belagire archers as well. I think we saw Numenor dump most of their ammo actually in the fight against Mordor, which may work against them here. I really can't imagine though that Arthedain and Dale have got all that much left in terms of ammunition either. Certainly their high tier units are brandishing their weapons. The Bardian marksmen have got their swords and shields. Not looking like much, so it may actually come down to both sides have already used up all their ammunition and it comes down to just pure muscle in melee. Slight numbers advantage going to Arthedain Dale. Quality edge, of course, going to Numenor. where will the battle fall ultimately? Right, okay, that's enough of that. Come on, time 6 speed. Both sides walking towards one another to preserve their fatigue. What's going on there? Aha! Well, well, well. Mordor yet live in this fight. I'm not entirely sure how WK managed to get his Arthedain Lancers out, but Mordor perhaps was something to say about this fight. I mean, they need to avoid the Pharaohs of Nobles like the plague, otherwise, even if the Pharaohs of Nobles are too depleted to beat the Arthedain Lancers, they'll do enough damage to the point where they lose a lot of their potency. Immediately the Pharaohs of Nobles going off. I mean, if Mordor want to be kingmakers in this situation, I would imagine they will probably focus on Numenor more so than Arthedain Dale, purely because of revenge purposes. We'll go down to 1 speed now, I think, because we're starting to approach a situation where a battle is somewhat inevitable. Again, Mordor finds themselves kind of stuck between the Numenor cavalry and some Arthedain pikes. So certainly no trust afforded to Mordor by Arthedain and Dale, which I can't really blame them for. Steel bows forming up. A fair amount of the units left actually are steel bows. I mean, they're fine in melee, but they're not going to be enjoying the prospect too much of having to go up against Barding Herd, which are still here in fairly decent numbers. Not what you'd call healthy, but for a late game, that is a decent force. The Arthedain Lancers waiting with menace, swords drawn at the moment rather than lancers, but that will change if they are committed to a fight. Kind of a Mexican standoff going on here, although one of the participants of the Mexican standoff has got a knife rather than a gun. Less dangerous perhaps, but still have to keep an eye on him. What will WK do here? I mean, he doesn't have too much in the way of options because, like, they know he's there. Anti-cavalry units are facing in this direction. You could maybe argue that Dale and Arthedain are a little bit more vulnerable, but this is going to be a fast fight, whatever it is. Which, again, if I was a betting man, I would say that maybe that favours Numenor, because their quality means they aren't routing anytime soon. Dale already losing their general means they're a bit more susceptible to that. Pharaohs of Nobles very, very deadly. Seafarers of Nindamos out of ammunition, but axes drawn. Numenor going to charge across the open field. There's a little bit of ranged action there. What will the Arthedain Lancers do? Shield Guard are going to try and maybe act as their shield on the flank. Very fittingly. Arthedain Cavalry coming in, trying to do the business now. A frontal charge into the Balaguer Archers. I mean, any kills they can get at this point could be enough to tip the scales in their favour. Balaguer Archers are going to rout pretty quickly. They need some more high quality units on the front line, which are arriving. Arrows and Swordmasters, Arthedain Lancers could still be the Kingmakers. I mean, having a look at this actually, looking at the Numenor numbers, I'd be surprised if they won this. Pharaohs and Swordmasters are strong, but they're not this strong, I don't think. Part of the problem as well is the phalanx nature of the Arthedain Dale front line. The Arthedain Lancers, of course, could also put an end to Numenor's hopes pretty quickly. Trying to go around the flank. I mean, the Pharaohs and Nobles could also be a very dangerous thing. The phalanx is only effective as long as it can keep holding on from the front. A mass rout would be the sort of thing which would do a lot of damage. That's already happening, actually. The Blackshot Dragon Slayers will stick around, but their basic Lake Town units that are meant to be their support are running for the hills pretty quickly. Morale already playing its part. The Arthedain Lancers cycling around and waiting, and they are trying to go after Numenor, that much is pretty apparent. Balance of forces evenly matched, but I mean, both sides are getting hammer and anvil charges here. That was a nice charge as well from the Dalian Cavalry, another good use of them, having already taken a few nibbles out of the Arrowites earlier on. Could Mordor win this? I don't know. One unit of Arthedain Lancers, they are completely healthy, but That's a pretty big ask. Was that WK? No, he's still here. One player has admitted defeat. It's not Engsfitz, it's not Morris. It's not Sin or Eclipse. So who is it then? Most peculiar. Yeah, morale is proving to be the killer here. Dale already a little bit vulnerable in that regard. Cavalry charges in the rear have proven to be a real difference maker. Otherwise a pike and halberd front line would have been fairly difficult for Numenor, I think, to actually deal with from the front. Interspersed with a little bit of quality. Tattered remnants of cavalry now. I mean, even the Pharaohs and Nobles charging into the rear of this formation is always going to be risky, because when the Barding Herd turn around they're going to do a lot of damage to you. Should be enough to see off what remains of the Knights of Illuminus, and they can continue to do what damage they can with these rear charges into the... Yeah, that's enough to rout 27 Bardian Marksmen, which that's a lot at this point in the battle. The Arthedain General falls as well, which means any Arthedain units that remain on the front line, which admittedly was not many. Dale were the healthier of the two human factions over here initially. The Arthedainian units looking a little bit worse for wear now. Numenus Gate Guard still here in fairly decent numbers. If this flanking move was intentional, it maybe came a little bit too slow. The Dalian front line crumbled before it arrived, but I mean, again, there's other stuff going on the battlefield as well. Routing Arthedain pikemen. It's a shame, actually, because if they had been maybe able to keep these units fighting with stuff like the Black Shots with the Arthedain pikes, the Dalian halberds, I really don't think Numenor would have been able to answer that, because as you can see there's not much of Numenor left, and they may even still end up losing this. The Arthedain Lancers loitering with intent back there, waiting to try their hand at whoever's left, I guess, with a charge, but actually running out of time to do that. Numenor now routing. Numenor don't have enough. So the initial prediction was correct. I think WK maybe has waited just a little bit too long. Dale charging in. Dale, of course, with their own rear charges, proving to be fairly effective as well against the far more depleted Numenorians. I mean, this is going to be a fairly nasty charge, but I would imagine the Arthedain Lancers are going to melt like butter in the face of the Numenus Gate Guards. Already shaken as well. Black Numenorians indeed. Dalian Royal Guard are here. Pharaohs and Nobles putting on a last stand for Numenor. Is that all the Arthedain Lancers could muster? They'll come in for another charge, but nearly half of their unit got demolished. Close margins, this. And as it turns out, the flanking move actually arrived just in time. My initial feeling about the numbers being a little bit too much for Numenor were correct, ultimately. I flip-flopped a lot there, actually, in the late game, because it was not really clear if disorganisation or lack of numbers or any factor there could have been enough to swing the battle one way or the other, but in the end, Dale and Arthedain able to keep themselves just organised enough with the numbers they had. Very close, though. Could have gone so wrong for them there. The Arthedain reinforcements arriving just in time. They just about managed to keep their high-tier units fighting. The morale shocks at the hands of the Numenor cavalry, not enough to bring them down in the end. Arthedain Lancers, I imagine, are going to be forced to charge in, really, against the pikes. The Numenorians run from the field, so Mordor actually outlasting Numenor in practical terms in this battle. One last spit in the eye for them. The Arthedain Lancers routing they out, or are they? Have they managed to outlast Numenor? Because that's the end of Mordor, surely. And Numenor are presumably still in the field. I mean, the two of them very close together. I mean, there's not many left. Arthedain Dale certainly sub 100 men left on the field that are not routing. That was a close one. Dale and Arthedain, though, able to beat Angmar and Isengard by a good enough margin to be able to then tackle Numenor. And you have to say a fairly decisive moment in this fight would have been the aggressive Mordor counterattack. As much as it wasn't enough to give them victory, in the end that was probably what denied Numenor the victory, because it was going very well for them. But in the end, that was more costly than they would have wanted it to be. And Arthedain and Dale were the ultimate benefactors of Mordor's aggression there. Angmar and Isengard, like I said, Isengard played their part in this battle as well in its narrative by refusing to allow Mordor to retreat, essentially, forcing them into that engagement, but maybe they weren't quite in step with Angmar, ready to really bring the hammer down on Arthedain and Dale. I mean, the players themselves will know a little bit more about that, but it was kind of hard to tell because it was quite a chaotic fight, which usually favours the Orcs, but clearly Arthedain and Dale able to pick their targets well, not only with their archers, but actually with their cavalry on this occasion as well. So I think worthy victors in the end. An interesting little free-for-all, this one. Let's see what did the damage for the Numenorians. Royal Legion of our Menelaus doing fairly well against Mordor. I mean, that's fairly run-of-the-mill for what you'd expect given Mordor's more numbers-focused approach. Numenorian cohort as well. Farazim Swordmasters with 405. That's obviously very good for any infantry unit, even one as high tier as the Farazim Swordmasters. To get over 400 kills is very impressive. Shield Guard getting over 200 kills. The Royal Guard as well. Obviously doing damage with their bows first before getting into melee, but a very tanky unit and enough to stomach the blows of Mordor. And then finally, Eclipse's army, again 620 for the Arthedain Shadow Bows. In a condensed fight like that, it was always going to be punishing for Mordor, and that's another example of how that would be the case. Sentinels doing very nicely, the pikes, but again, these units we didn't really see too much of in the fight, and that was because they committed themselves to that very violent engagement against Mordor, which was just a real clusterfuck of an engagement, really. And there you go. Shield Guard doing okay. 200 kills on Numenor and cohort as well. So yeah, lots of high numbers, but you'd expect that given the more numbers-focused approach of both of the Mordor armies, and ultimately how the deployment zones fell and the initial setups were pretty decisive in this one. And yeah, not much Mordor could do about that. They did well, all things considered, and they certainly contributed to the outcome of the fight. But I do think, worthy victors in the end. I actually wouldn't have been... I think all of the armies on this occasion, none of them played badly. Any of them would have been worthy victors in the end, because if Angmar and Isengard were able to be victorious here, it would have been a sign ultimately that they deserved it against Dale and Arthedain, and then if they'd have turned around and gone on to win, then it was what it was. But ultimately, the modern humans, the ones to be victorious here. So yeah, big thank you to Sin of the Dark Cloud for sending that one to me. Nice to see some names we haven't seen in a while in the lineup as well. Nice to see a free-for-all too. I've got, I think, one of the Winged Swordsman sieges that he sent me is going to be coming up before this one. And there will also be 2, maybe even 3 more actually following on from this. Now, I'm sure by this point people will be wondering where the next of the bracket-based videos is. The reason I haven't been able to do that is because I've been away from the PC for quite a while, so both visiting home and ultimately work trips away. So what I've been having to do is record in bulk in a fairly extreme manner, which means these I do them one after the other essentially, and just try to cover the time. I'll be getting to that as soon as I can, but ultimately I think the month of May will completely lack one of those videos, and it will be June before that actually happens. Speaking of which, it will also be June, I think, before we do the live stream follow-up to the channel update I did recently, and also I do have more information on that now, but I can't do that until June because I'm not sure whether I'll be going away for work on short notice, so it's better to do it in my off-call period. But again, good information there which I will need to be sharing because it is relevant and it will affect the channel later on in the year, I think. But it will affect the channel at some point in the future irregardless, so in a good way, so that's something to look forward to as well. And yeah, I think there's another Silmarillion battle that I've got coming up as well, so for the time being it will be battle replays for the next 3 or so weeks before we get into another bracket video and a channel update live stream, and obviously the regular content will continue as it has done. But yeah, big thank you to Sin for sending this battle replay in. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.